Die US-Wahl ist im vollen Gange und es ist noch überhaupt nicht sicher, wer der Gewinner sein wird. Und es ist überhaupt nicht sicher, ob wir heute überhaupt erfahren werden, wer der nächste Präsident der USA sein wird. Aber wie schaut es in den Staaten aus? Wie war der Wahltag bis jetzt und was ist die Prognose? Darüber spreche ich mit Hans Knoll. Er ist Politikwissenschaftler und Professor an der Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Hi Hans, how is the election night going?
It's going all right. The really, as far as the experience is going, the fact that we have the COVID pandemic means everybody's at home when I'm just, watching with my family. But so far it's, not a lot of surprises. So more or less as expected.
Yeah, so the upcoming results or the results we already have are just as expected, would you say?
More or less, yeah. Of course, there was some uncertainty about some of the states. I think that polling had Biden doing better in Florida than it looks like he's going to end up doing, but it was always looking very close in Florida, and in fact, it is close. There's yet to be any state that's been a sort of surprise flip from either expectations or, frankly, from the last election.
Right now, it looks like Biden's gonna win in Arizona. Is this a surprise?
So that's not really a big surprise, although that would be the first flip. I know some networks have called Arizona for Biden. Others are still saying it's too close to call. That's would be a change from 2016, and it would be a bit of a surprise, but not much. That Arizona has been moving towards the Democrats for a while now, just as New Mexico has voted with Democrats the last couple of elections. It's demographically similar to Southern California and New Mexico, and sort of in that same range. Large Hispanic population, which are more likely to vote for Democrats. So that move has been happening, and it's sort of not too big of a surprise that it finally crossed that line.
There were voices that screamed that it's a possibility for Biden to actually win Texas or turn Texas into a swing state. Is this a political reality, or is this just a Democratic hope?
I think it's mostly just a Democratic hope at this point, but the margins in Texas have been narrowing. It used to be that Texas was a very clear advantage to Republicans. It was a state that they could count on in much the same way that Democrats count on California and the other West Coast states. And that's no longer the case. It's still, it's still open, and it may end up being very close. My guess is that this year won't be the year that it first switches to be voting Democratic, but probably will happen, assuming trends continue in this way that they are in one of the next upcoming elections, in 4 or 8 years.
Is this because of shifting demographics of Texas?
So mostly it's shifting demographic efforts, so that Texas is already a state with a large Latino population, and it's increasing. So that's part of it. It's also a shift a little bit in the coalitions of the parties, so that the Republican Party is increasingly relying on rural white voters, which has been part of their base, but increasingly so, and increasingly losing suburban voters in all cities. And we look at Texas, and it's huge, and we think about ranches and everything else. But Texas is still, most of the Texas voters live in major cities like Houston and Dallas, which are increasingly blue. So Texas is moving in that direction, and it's not just about the changing demographics; it's also changing coalitions. Add those two together, and it'll be a blue state, or at least a purple state, probably in a few elections.
Why did Joe Biden not convince the Black and Latino voters in Florida to vote for him?
Yeah, so I think definitely the sort of early evidence suggests that it's Latino voters in particular in Florida that Biden is losing. Trump has gained relative to 2016 with Latino voters and with Black voters. And in particular with Latino and Latino men voters. It's important to note that both Black and Latino demographics, but especially Latinos, are different across the country. So Latinos in Florida are not the same as Latinos in Texas or Latinos in Arizona. And most Latinos in Florida are either Cuban, which is different because they've come over from Cuba, or have come from other South American communities where there's been a history of socialism and particularly socialist dictators. And so the claim that Biden might be a gateway to socialism is going to resonate with those voters more than it might resonate with a Hispanic voter in, say, Arizona. And that might be an explanation for why Biden doesn't do as well with those voters in Florida.
Could you say this whole, let's call it post-socialist trauma of Latino Cuban voters in Florida is the reason why they traditionally vote Republican?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the traditional story on Cuban voters in particular is, that they were the ones who left Cuba because they were more conservative and more wealthy and didn't want to live through the transition to socialism, and they see that as being a horrible thing that happened in their home country. The same as with some of these other post-socialist, as you say. And so, yeah, that's a big part of what's happening for those voters. And it just happens that there's a large community of voters like that in Florida. The immigration from Latin American countries to other parts of the United States isn't as heavy among that group.
What would you say? Which states are right now the ones that this race is coming down to?
So we mentioned Arizona, and Arizona going for Biden, if that is what happens, is a big deal. But I think it really is coming down to, as most people expected, Pennsylvania, and then probably Michigan and Wisconsin. What I'm hearing is that Michigan looks like it's pretty likely to actually go for Biden, although the current count is not like that. The current count, of course, doesn't include a lot of mail-in ballots that haven't gotten to yet. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are looking a lot closer. And those states, of course, will take a long time. Both in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they're not allowed to count the votes until today. And in some places, they're not even going to try to start counting mail-in ballots until tomorrow. So we wouldn't expect to have results in either of those states, but it does look like it's going to come down to those states. If Biden picks those states up, and as well as holding on to all the other states that Clinton won, then it looks like Biden wins. If he can't pick those up, then that's the path that Trump would have to hold on to the White House.
And what is your prediction? Do we know a winner by today or tonight?
I think no. I think that probably not a winner by tonight. That was a possibility when we thought Florida was closer, right? Because Florida will probably get counted, and we'll have Florida settled probably sometime in the next several hours, I would guess. It's looking clearly that it's going to be for Trump. Had it been instead for Biden, that would have been very informative, but it's not. And so instead now we're going to have to rest on results from the other states that are going to take a lot longer to count.
And one last question, because we heard a lot about some irregulations in the voting process or some kind of voter suppression. Were there any sites of voter suppression in the States, or was it a relatively calm election day?
Well, that's a little hard to know at this point because I only see what I've seen reported. Most voter suppression is a little bit subtle in that it encourages people to go to the wrong place, or we have very long lines and these sorts of things that then, of course, discourage people from voting. But it also could be that surprising high turnout and underfunded polling places just happen to have longer lines, and that wasn't deliberate voter suppression, although it still works out to be that discourages people from voting. And a good solution would be to do a better job funding local election administrators. Elections in the United States are run by the individual states, and then most of the states devolve that power to the local administrators. So everything is run by all of these local election boards that are doing things very well. Actually, I think they try very hard, but there's lots of room for human error or for lack of resources to have effects.
So the race keeps being excited the whole night or maybe the whole week before states like Michigan or Wisconsin are actually allowed to count their ballots.
Yeah, so well, I mean, they're allowed to start counting them now, but by the time they get finished, which might very well be much later in the week. And who knows? I'm hearing, for instance, that in Wisconsin, the voting tallying machines just aren't working as fast as they expected them to, right? And so now that's just going to mean it's going to take longer. And it's always the case that it takes many, many days, sometimes a very long time, before we know the exact count. Usually that doesn't matter in terms of determining the winner, but it still takes a long time. But if it's close, then we'll have to wait for them to finish before we'll know.
So as a resume, if Trump takes Florida and Biden takes Arizona, it's about Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those states are gonna decide the presidency.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think even if Biden does pick up Arizona, he's going to need to do well in at least some of those other states. So the race is now about Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan.
Thank you, Hans Knoll. Thank you for your time. Take care.
Right, thank you. Take care.
Es ist also unwahrscheinlich, dass wir heute noch ein wirklich endgültiges Ergebnis bekommen. Michigan, Pennsylvania und Wisconsin, auf diese 3 Staaten kommt es jetzt an.